Oh, it's cold, isn't it? Yeah, all right. Mary Gleim, Gleim. I know some of you heard some of it as you were coming up. So what I'd like you to do is put away your notebooks, though, because not everything in there is the truth. You know, I'm going to tell you what's true and what's not. Now, I was born in Ireland in 1845. I'm actually right here. In 1845, and it was at the height of the potato famine. So we were, no sympathy? No? Oh, poor Mary. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you it was audience participation, didn't I? Okay. Poor Mary. Well, my family moved to London, and shortly after we moved there, I found out that there was something I was really good at: making money. Now, the first time I got thrown in jail was for what the London Metropolitan Police Department called larceny. We called it roll 'em in the gutter. Now, let me explain it to you. Let's say, because you're right in front of me, it's Saturday afternoon and you've just gotten paid. Because, you know, this is London, this is this is 1800s. Everybody worked all the way through Saturday. So you've got your pockets full of your coins, and you decide to stop off at your local corner bar, right? Right? Yeah. So you're drinking, and then you're drinking, and then you're drinking, and then all of a sudden you come out and you kind of trip over and you drop down and you're out, okay? Now, your pockets are probably still full of some of that money that you made that week, right? Absolutely. Okay, well, it's not going to do you any good. So we would go over and literally roll them in the gutter. We'd roll them over, rifle through the pockets, get the money, and off we'd go. Well, like I said, the Metropolitan Police Department didn't think too highly of that, so I spent a couple months in jail the first time. Now, the second time, though, that I went to jail, I was arrested for running a bawdy house. Now, I do have some young ones here, so I will be using what I call my euphemisms. But you can tell already, this was just a matter of a couple years, I knew what I was doing. I'd gone from that to, you know, running a place. So I think that was pretty good. When I got out, that was about 18 months the second time. When I got out, I met a man by the name of John Edgar Gleim. Now, John Edgar was a bit of, hey, how are you? Old customer. John Edgar was over from St. Louis, and he had just inherited $100,000 from his grandfather's estate. And, you know, I thought that was pretty good, so I got to know him, and I convinced him that we should get married, and then I would take a hold of the money, and I'd give him what he wanted, because really all he liked to do was drink and gamble anyway. But if I gave him enough, then I could take the rest of it and I'd keep turning it over and making more, not rolling in the gutter turning over, but, making more money. And John Edgar agreed to that. However, before we had a chance to get married, he got in a fight and tried to kill a guy in a bar. So he spent a year in jail. But as soon as he got out, we went right down and got married, And then it was off to America. Well, we went to St. Louis to meet his family. They didn't like me. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I was Irish, I don't know. But his family didn't take too kindly to me. So we didn't stay long, but long enough so that I got a good look at what his family was doing. They were pretty well off, and they owned a lot of property in and around the town of St. Louis. So I kind of kept that in the back of my mind. And we then just decided to travel across the United States. Well, later on, several years later, during one of my many, many trials, one of the prosecuting attorneys asked me, "Isn't it true, Mrs. Gleim, that you were in the Rogues Gallery? Wasn't your picture up in the halls of the New York Police Department?" And I said, "Well, if it was a damn good picture, wasn't it?" That has become one of those myths that you hear about. Mary Gleim was in the Rogues Gallery. Well, I happen to have the Rogues Gallery right here, and I am not in it. So don't believe that. Yeah, this is a real thing, yeah. Oh, it's just 247 professional criminals of the 19th century America. I am not in this. So we traveled across the United States, and of course we traveled by train. And as you probably know, the trains built the West, right? Now, we have a situation similar to the on the Saturday when you have gotten paid and you've built the railroad out to here. Well, what are you going to do with your money? Well, the saloon owners, the owners of female boarding houses, nobody's responding, and thank you, okay. They would come just right at the end of the tracks, and literally it would be tents or whatever. But then as the towns began to grow up, and this wasn't just Missoula, this was all over the West, the towns were made of wood. Of course, because that's what we had. Trees were everywhere. So we had, in my day, what they called boardwalks. I believe today, now you would call them sidewalks. But in my day, they were called boardwalks. Well, what the railroad workers would do, and don't anybody trip on my line, please, they would bring their lanterns into town with them, and they would set them down in front of the establishment that they were frequenting that night, and that way, if there were a problem at the railroad yard, they'd be able to find them by where their lanterns were. Now, the only problem with that is we've got a wooden sidewalk, and this has kerosene, candles. Now imagine if you are sitting in a saloon and you've got the best hand in poker that you've ever had, and some drunk comes along and tips over the lantern, sets the boardwalk on fire, and you have to get out really, really fast, right? It's not going to work very well. So pretty soon, the madams and the saloon owners and the store owners found out that if they would put up hooks or just nails, whatever, at the doors, then the railroad workers could hang their lanterns up. That way, nobody's going to burn down the house or the sidewalk. Hence, we have the term red light district. Thank you. Very good. You guys are really smart. Okay, so John Edgar and I got off the train in Missoula, probably much like a lot of you. Thought, oh, this is a nice little town. I think we're going to stay here. Hey, you haven't been to see me in years. We're going to talk about that. So we got off, and I decided, yeah, we're gonna do some business here. Now, have any of you been up to see Woody yet, Judge Woody? Yep. Mayor Woody? Yeah.
Was he one of your patrons?
No, he was a founder of this town. He was the mayor and the sheriff, and oh, I hear him fainting away, even as you've said that. No. But what happened was, I took $10,000, and I'll pass this around. $10,000. Now, this is June 1889, and this is called a sole trader certificate. And what this does is, by agreeing to take my $10,000, because you know it's my money, right? Not John Edgar's. Okay. By agreeing to take my money, they would let me do business in my own name. Now, this was very unusual, because in this time period, there were laws in most states that women could not own businesses. You could not own any property or anything in your own name. So I guess that $10,000 slid across the table was the magic number for the founders of Missoula. I was off and running. And you might notice as you look at it that it does say that my business is general merchandise. Now, at one time, I owned 7 buildings on Front Street. What the young ladies did in the female boarding houses was up to them as long as they paid their rent on time. But I also had a Chinese laundry in one of my buildings. I had a bowling alley. So I considered myself a capitalist. You know, I mean, Carnegie was a capitalist, right? Rockefeller was a capitalist. Why couldn't I be a capitalist, right? The businesses were in my own name. That's what I considered myself, a capitalist. Now, there was a newspaper that was out before the Missoulian. It was called the Missoula Gazette. And you can see that my sole trader certificate is marked June. I got a little ahead of myself. This is May 22nd, 1889. Mrs. M. Gleim, that's me, begs to inform the public that she has just returned from Chicago with 2 carloads of the newest and latest styles in furniture. Having more than she requires for her own new lodging house, she will sell bedroom sets and lounges, spring mattresses, wool mattresses at cost price. Don't forget to call at the big new red house on Main Street. No reasonable offer will be refused. However, wire spring mattresses start at $3.50, and I was off and running. Now, there were some problems along the way. You'll hear about another man by the name of Bobby Burns. He owned some property on Front Street also. He was not my rival. I owned more property at any time than Bobby Burns ever owned. But he made life miserable for me, and as did I mention that Woody was also a judge? Yeah, okay. Well, here's something now. June 11th, 1890. And this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. What they were inquiring about, I don't know, but it says silk dresses and laces were seized late last night from a Mrs. Gleim, who was a cabin passenger on the steamboat Arizona, which yesterday arrived from Liverpool. The goods were in a trunk. Mrs. Gleim arrived with her husband, her son, and her daughter en route to Montana. When asked to declare her goods, she says, oh, there wasn't anything there. Well, they found these dresses, and they thought I was trying to smuggle in lace and silk, etc. And so they confiscated that, but since I had nothing on me, they couldn't arrest me, so they had to let me go. But what I still just makes me chuckle is I didn't have a son or a daughter. I was smuggling in my niece and nephew. They thought it was the clothes. No, it was people. Anyway, I had sent my niece Elizabeth to convent school where she was raised. And then when she became age appropriate, around 18, 19, I brought her over. Well, she was rather surprised when she got here to find out that I was the owner of female boarding houses. And she took off and went to Butte and eloped. Now, as someone pointed out in the last group, that wasn't much of a step up, was it? But they then, oh, and let's see, where is he? Oh, that's, yeah, right there. Yeah, Gibson. Yeah, that's her son, but he's around here somewhere. They moved to Anaconda, where he worked in the mines, and being a good Catholic girl, she had 10 children. So, wasn't much good to me, but there you go. Now, I was in California, so I knew nothing about this next incident, nothing. But when I came home, apparently someone had dynamited Bobby Burns' house. His house one night just blew up right there on Front Street. They said in the Missoulian that it was so loud that they had thought they had loosed the artillery at the fort. So, yeah. Well, Woody got 2 soldiers from the fort to finger me and say that I put them up to it, that I paid them and bought the I mean, do I look like someone who carries dynamite around with her? Come on. Well, he threw me in jail, and there was a big trial. And after 3 days, I was found guilty of first-degree attempted murder. I mentioned that Bobby Burns wasn't home, right? Anyway, slam bam. I was off, and they put me on the train, and I was off to Deer Lodge. Now, when I got to Deer Lodge, there was a big, huge, this is 11-foot fence maybe around it, all wooden, all wood. And again, I ask you, since you seem to know me so well, do I look like someone who would climb over a fence to get out of prison? I don't know what Warden Conley was thinking, but he tore down that fence and he built that big, huge wall that's there now. Now, have you been to Deer Lodge? No, you've been to Deer Lodge? Yeah. Oh, honey, I'm not saying that you've been in it. I just want to know if you've been there. Yeah, okay. So he built that big. So, at least I wasn't bored. I got to watch the wall being built. Now, my case was appealed, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the state of Montana. And they looked over some of the paperwork, and they turned it over and sent it back down for a retrial. Now, if you haven't seen Judge Woody yet, you remember this when you get up there. Apparently, 2 of the men that were on the jury were convicted felons. Oh, that's a no-no. You can't do that. And a 3rd man had said to Judge Woody, I'm sorry, sir, I'm not a citizen of the United States. And Woody said, okay, sign this piece of paper. Go ahead, sign the paper. Thank you. Now you're a citizen. Go sit in the jury box. The Supreme Court didn't like that either. Well, when Bobby Burns heard that the case had been overturned and I was set free and coming back for retrial, he had the decency to drop dead of a heart attack on the Higgins Avenue Bridge. So by the time I got back to town, there was nobody to testify against me. So they had to drop the charges and I was free to go. There were some other things. French Emma tried to kill me. She was going to kill me. So I got thrown in jail for beating her up. They said that I ripped some priests' robes, and I fainted in the rectory, and I was trying to get the priest to hold me up. And so that's how things get started, these rumors and lies. Now, in the meantime, John Edgar has passed away, and I did take him back to St. Louis and buried him back there. And while I was there, there was a really nice, choice piece of property that had belonged to him that I thought should be mine because I was the widow, the grieving widow. Oh. So they didn't think so, and the family fought me. That went all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court, and I lost that case. So I do think about that quite often, though, because it was a nice piece of property, and I did hear later on that the family sold it to the federal government, and then they put up some kind of monument there or something. But I'm sure that you got it. I'm sure that I would have gotten a better price for it than they got. I did, thank goodness, everybody was so happy when I passed away in 1914. Now, here's the last rumor that you may have heard or read, is that in my will, I asked that my tombstone be faced so the railroad boys could wave at me. Now, that's a real cute story, but it's not true. Number one, I didn't leave a will. And it took a year to probate my estate. And this is 1915. It ended up being $145,000. Now, in today's money, that's a couple $1 million. So, who is a capitalist, huh? Yeah. So my niece and my nephew, very grateful to have gotten this great estate, bought the tombstone, and I mean, you can see, quite frankly, when they got it here, it's just too damn big to sit this way. They had to put it sideways. But what I will leave you with is, you may have heard that this is our last year, and I really want to thank everybody for coming out, especially on a day like today. But Gleim, G-L-E-I-M, and it's on the other side too. So as you're driving along here, if you just happen to glance over, just give me a honk or a wave just so I know that you haven't forgotten me, okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to talk about A.J. Gibson, who was one of Missoula's most prolific architects as far as the number of projects he did, and was really influential in a lot of the early development of Missoula, especially with a lot of the major buildings that were built here in Missoula, as well as across the northwest here. He had projects all over, clear down to Hamilton, up to the northwest into Idaho, and even some buildings back in Ohio where he is from. He was born in Ohio in 1862 and came to Montana in 1883 after his father died. But in Ohio he worked on the farm and was more of a carpenter. He developed his skills as a carpenter and builder and designed and built several buildings related to the farms, but also was really how he was self-taught to be an architect and how buildings are actually put together. He came to Butte in 1883 and started work for Henry Patterson, who was a local builder there, and they built some of the early buildings in Butte. Patterson was pretty influential as far as architecture in Butte. He and Gibson were self-taught more as architects, and as Patterson went on to design some of the major structures in Butte. By 1888, though, Gibson decided that he needed to move on to some other area so he could have some more influence in the architecture and building. So he moved to Missoula in 1888 and started his own construction firm right behind his house there on 2nd Street, south between Orange and Higgins, and where his house still is. And he started building there and then decided to become more of an architect, again being self-taught and designing buildings, and really started to be very influential in the community. He started with some of the early buildings were like the first 5 buildings at the University of Montana. He designed Main Hall and the Science Building, which is gone, the Women's Dormitory, which is now the Math Building. That's one of his buildings, and then the first library on campus, officials, library as a building. He designed that in 1908, and that's where Jeanette Rankin Hall is at. He also designed a gymnasium behind Main Hall for the campus, but of course that's been taken down too over the years as they moved the fields around to different locations. He had quite a sense of architecture and really, just understanding how buildings are put together and really how they related to the community, and so he got very involved in a lot more community projects. Of course, some of the early schools, Lowell School, Hawthorne School, those were his buildings. He also designed the first county school, county high school, which of course is Hellgate, and that center section is still there, that right where the main doors are off of Higgins there is part of his design, what's been added to over the years. He also was influential in the Missoula County Courthouse, designed that building, and was a very important person as far as not only designing it, but getting the community to be involved in building a courthouse. There was an original courthouse there, but they needed a bigger building, so we designed that in that sort of Beaux-Art style of architecture. He also, as far as some of the homes around Missoula, the Dixon House, which is now the Center of Repose over on Pine Street there, the Greeno Mansion, which of course is not moved up to the hill, there as a restaurant in the 60s. That building was burned in the 1980s and was gone. But he also was involved in a lot of other houses and flats throughout the area. The University Flats, which is there on Higgins, just as you go off Brooks there, it's right behind the new metal building there. That was some of his flats that he designed. He called them flats. They're essentially apartments, but he was involved in a lot of those throughout that neighborhood, especially. And then also down in south in Hamilton area. He designed the courthouse here in Hamilton, which is now the Historical Museum. And he was involved also with the Daly Mansion. Designed that in 1910, and actually good architecture about that time in 1909, which still was influential in getting it built, which is essentially the third structure there that even have built over an existing structure. His work went all the way up into northwestern Montana, up into Kalispell, those areas as well, all over to Idaho. And so really a lot of influence in the first years of this whole part of the West was being developed. And even though there was not a lot written about him at the time, there's a book out now, but really, if you look at all the different architects in here, like Frank Lloyd Wright and Vasky Gilbert and some of those that got a lot of influence in Montana too, he probably did a lot more than they did as far as this community and really getting it going in that period from 1890 to about 1910. And again, influenced a lot of design up until his death. He and his wife, Maud Lockley, they were married in 1889. That was the year Montana became a state. She was from Butte, and they were married a year after he came here to Missoula. She was a photographer and writer, and really was influential in his work because she wrote a lot about his work, took photographs of it, wrote stories for the papers and things like that about the different activities. Both of them were also very influential as far as other community activities. They never had any children, but they did have a lot of children that came to stay with them for a while when people were having hard times. They were able to bring some of the younger children in and take care of them until people could get back on their feet. So they had that influence even though they didn't have children of their own. The automobile was something that they both liked. They liked to travel, so they were one of the first ones to have an automobile here in Missoula. And they traveled all over. They even went back to New York City, even though there weren't roads. So I'm sure half of it was on a rail car. But anyway, and then also went to Canada and Mexico and traveled all around. They were like the conservation of our natural wonders and things like that, and I think that influenced the gravestones that you see here, which Maud was the designer of, and she designed it mainly as a boulder, as with the Gibson name on the front and back, and then the two small headstones here. The saying that she has there, "I love thy rocks and rills, thy woods and templed hills." Does anybody know where what that came out of, or have you ever seen that in any? It's a hard one because we never sing the second verse of "My Country 'Tis of Thee," and that's where it's from. It's a patriotic song from 1932 that that was part of. But like I said, it's really a very influential family. Of course, the automobiles that also was part of their death. They were driving out to a nursery to get some flowers for a New Year's Eve party and crossed the tracks right around Grant Street there, and a freight train hit them, and they both died instantly from the freight train. So that's why they're both on December 31st, 1927, when they passed away. Again, some of the organization, he was American Order of Odd Fellows. That isn't right, I don't think, because we can't find anything else. It's supposed to be AOOF, but anyway, that's the only thing we can think of. It probably was, and she was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. But anyway, both very influential in the community, but as far as the architecture, A.J. Gibson was really very influential on how Missoula developed and how it became a great city. So, any questions or comments? Yeah.
Was she fit in the feminist causes quite a bit?
She was, yeah, oh yeah, very much so, and yeah, pretty influential.
I didn't hear the story.
Yeah. But, yeah, the Gibson Mansion, which is really the Peterson Mansion. They call it the Gibson Mansion because he was the architect, but Peterson was the drugstore where Butterfly Herbs is. It still says Peterson Drugs in the.
Where is that?
No, downtown Missoula there on the 200 block. but that's where the old drugstore. But the Peterson Mansion used to be over by the behind Hellgate High School,
Oh, so
and
that's been moved?
that's been moved. And the people there have decided rather than call it the Peterson Mansion, they call it the Gibson Mansion because he designed it and built
So
it.
it used to be behind in the university district somewhere?
Yeah, and the university, right where the gymnasium is, the new part of the gymnasium at Hellgate High School on Gerald there. That's where it used to sit. Yeah.
Are you from Missoula? Not originally. But have you heard of Edgar S. Paxson?
No, but I know the last name.
We need to remember him. He was a nationally known painter, still is, but never acquired necessarily the recognition as Frederick Remington, a contemporary artist, and Charlie Russell. Nonetheless, Edgar S. Paxson was well acquainted with Charlie Russell. It's kind of funny. They both left home in the East when they were young. Charlie Russell left St. Louis to come to the Montana Territory. And Edgar S. Paxson, born near Buffalo, New York in 1852, decided to come west when he was 20 years old. His father had a successful carriage painting business in New York. And Edgar S. Paxson, as a young man, learned some of the skills of painting with paintbrushes. He carried brushes and pencils and sketchbooks when he came with him when he arrived in Montana Territory as a young man. He sketched when he could, but in the meantime he was busy working for ranchers in southwest Montana as a hunter and as a courier delivering mail and newspapers. Only 5'4" and 140 pounds, he could travel swiftly. He went back east in 1874 to marry Laura, an old sweetheart. In 1876, when they were in Montana, he had heard of the Custer battle at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And he became very much interested in that battle and decided if he was to become a painter, which he wanted to become, a realist painter of the West, painting the Custer battle could be a great idea. If it was done well, it could bring him recognition as a painter. So for 20 years, he researched the battle, visiting the battlefield 3 times, interviewing dozens of troops, Indians, and visiting the battlefield itself with Major Reno in 1878. In Montana, he was lucky that John McGuire left San Francisco and came to Montana. After a career acting in San Francisco, he came to Butte to open an opera house. Little entertainment in those days, and opera houses were very popular. He built, I think, 2 opera houses in Butte, one in Phillipsburg, which is still in operation today, one in Deer Lodge, Anaconda, and he needed someone to paint backdrops for his theater. And Edgar spent a lot of the years there painting backdrops for theater and signs, but all the while thinking about this Custer battlefield painting, trying to improve his talents as a painter. And finally his talents caught up with his dream, and it came to fruition after 6 years of painting. In 1899, he finished it. It was 6 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and he sent it on a tour to cities back east, New York City, Washington, D.C., Chicago. People paid 25 cents to see the painting. That's about $6 in today's money. And again, this is before movie theaters. This was entertainment, to pay and go in and gaze at this painting. Libby Custer, the widow of George, came and saw this painting in Washington, D.C. several times, at times bringing her to tears. The painting was a success as far as the tour and bringing recognition to Edgar S. Paxson. About that time, Edgar S. Paxson decided to move his family from Butte to Missoula. The air pollution in Butte at that time was pretty bad. Heap roasting the ore outside on the ground in piles of logs and ore. The poisonous air, they fled to Missoula in 1906 and bought a house on Stevens Avenue. 611 Stevens, the home is still there today. This painting resided in the home, having public viewings once at the Florence Hotel and once at the Presbyterian Church in Missoula. The painting then ended up at the University of Montana in the Science Building until 1954, dimly lit there. Eventually it was sold to the Buffalo Bill Cody Museum in Cody, Wyoming, where it is today. In 1911, the state of Montana commissioned Edgar S. Paxson to paint murals in our state capitol. And 6 of them can be seen today outside the House of Representatives. In 1913, Missoula County commissioned him to paint 8 murals in our county courthouse. And they're a treasure we have today in Missoula. The city, or the county, commissioned Edgar to paint those paintings for only $1,500, those 8 murals. And that is an example of how all through his life, Paxson undervalued his work. His commission should have been twice that for our Missoula County murals, but he happily agreed. He continued painting till the end of his life here in Missoula. During World War I, it kind of slowed down the business of selling paintings. His son, Robert, went and fought in World War I on the front lines in France and was able to come back to Missoula, Robert Paxson. And years later, one of Paxson's paintings became quite popular, or let's say recognized, when Stephen Ambrose, the author of Undaunted Courage, his best-selling book about Lewis and Clark, when they chose Paxson's mural from our House of Representatives in Helena, the painting called Lewis and Clark at Three Forks, with Sacagawea, her husband Charbonneau, the captains, and York, etc. This has now, I'm sure, been seen by a lot of people, this Paxson painting. And maybe now this is his most famous painting. But he is here with his wife Laura buried. And thank you for coming out today.
Welcome, Stories and Stones. I'm Frank Woody, and I was one of the first Euro-Americans through this valley. I came through here, actually the first to kind of settle in this area. But I was born in North Carolina in 1833 and to a Quaker family, and then moved west, went to Illinois and clerked for a fellow by the name of Joe Cannon, who became one of the most powerful speakers of the U.S. House of Representatives in history. And I clerked for him for a while, and then I went on to Kansas, and then ended up in Utah, sick and broke, and 23 years old, at a time when there was something called the Mormon Wars going on, or the Mormon War. And you did not want to be not a Mormon at that time. So I pretended I was a Mormon and looked for a way to get out of Utah. And I found that when I heard that there was a man by the name of Van Etten that was going to bring supplies to a place a long ways away from Utah. called Hellgate, this valley called Hellgate. And I was so desperate, I signed on with him. He had oxen teams, and we brought supplies to Fort Owen, which was up the Bitterroot in Stevensville. And I came into the Missoula Valley and saw what I thought were probably, in counting them, about 300 Indian teepees at that time. So I realized that this was a place where there were a lot of gatherings and a lot of trading going on, and I kept that in the back of my mind, that this might be a good place to have a business as far as trade goes. So I went from here to Walla Walla, Washington, which is, Walla Walla was the fort along the Columbia River, and a little town had formed there, and I got to be a clerk for Frank Warden, who ran a store there. And shortly after that, Captain Higgins, Christopher Higgins, he was also involved with Warden, and the three of us decided to come back here and start a trading post. Actually, I came back a year earlier and planted some crops. I was the first person to actually furrow and plant a crop with a wooden plow here. And my crops was mainly vegetables, and unfortunately there was a freeze in August and it killed all my crops, so I decided I wasn't cut out to be a farmer. So I went back to Walla Walla and clerked with them again for a while, and then in 1860 we brought 75 or so mules out here with supplies, including a safe, including Warden's huge iron safe. And it was long, it was over 400 miles that we traveled, so it took a long time. So we started a store and a tent first, and then eventually built a cabin, and that became the village of Hellgate. During its life of about 5 years, it was a very violent place. The vigilantes were chasing the outlaws over here in 1864 and caught them and hanged 5 of them in the general vicinity, several of them off of Captain Higgins's corral posts. So there were more violent deaths in the 5 years that Hellgate was going than there were natural deaths. But I was kind of the, considered, had an education of sorts, and so I began practicing law, and that's about all you had to do in those days was practice on somebody. That, unfortunately or fortunately, you knew something or you didn't. And I practiced on a fellow by the name of Tin Cup Joe, who had a lawsuit against Baron O'Keefe because one of his horses had fallen in a hole on Baron O'Keefe's land, so he wanted compensation. And there was a trial out at Hellgate, and I represented Tin Cup Joe, and during the trial there was a fist fight because somebody questioned somebody else's credentials as far as whether are you really a lawyer or something like that, and a fight broke out, and the jury ran, and just we had to gather up the jury and start the trial over again. So after that, we moved into what is now Missoula and built David Patty, who had a little farm up Patty Canyon. He built a mill, a flour mill, and a lumber mill because people were starting to settle here, and that was around 1865. And so Missoula became Missoula Mills at that time for a while. And the city started developing around that mills, which is now known as Front Street. And I became postmaster, and in 1883, Missoula was just a small village, and we were waiting for the railroad to come through, so we gave them all kinds of prime lots for them to build their shops here, and they did. And So I was elected first mayor of Missoula, and when the railroad came, we broke out this keg of whiskey that I'd had for years and had a big party. There were more than 1,500 railroad workers, and there were only about 400 residents in the town. So you can imagine the railroad workers drank most of the whiskey. But anyway, I had a very successful career then. I was elected a judge, justice of the peace, and then a judge, and I was instrumental in starting the Historical Society in Montana, and wrote the first history of Missoula, which is fairly accurate. There's a few things that you find every year. You find something different about a so-called historical fact. But had a good career here, and I became, at the time of my passing in 1916, I was the longest living resident in Missoula because I had gotten here so early and was part of that founding with Higgins and Warden. And my funeral was quite the procession, as they say. It went down Broadway, which is a thing called Cedar Street, because it had cedar water pipes. And then the Masonic band was following, and all of the businesses closed down for my funeral. And we turned then on Orange Street and went to my mansion, which was right across from the St. Francis Church, where a tire company is today, on Orange and Pine. And anyway, then we came out here, and I was laid to rest, and had been at rest until about 12 years ago when they started this Stories and Stones thing, and woke me up, and I thought it might be a lot of fun, so I've been doing that ever since. And
Lawyers never die.
I just, true, and I figured if the Rolling Stones could tour at their age, I could get up, and do this once a year. So I have ever since. But one of the best decisions I made in my life was marrying Sarah, and so I'm going to turn it over to her because she always has the last word anyway.
She's 20 years younger, though.
You had to bring that up, didn't you?
Well, my name is Sarah Elizabeth Countryman Woody, and I was born in Northern California in 1853. My family originated in Iowa, but during the gold rush years, they traveled to California. My father was a stonemason and a millwright, and he got his money from the miners. He operated a stamp mill that crushed the quartz rock and extracted the gold. When I was a year old, they wanted to go back to Iowa, so we traveled by ship down the west coast, crossed the Isthmus of Panama. You have that lovely canal now. It makes travel so much easier.
That was kind of the wrong way to go, wasn't it?
You know, and you'll remember this, when you come from the east to the west, you usually come with a large group in a wagon train. But when you're going back to the United States from the west, you're often traveling by yourself. And that's a very vulnerable way to go. So traveling by ship was, it was not for the faint of heart. It was a wild ride, but it was safer than traveling through uninhabited territory back to the States. We didn't stay in Iowa very long, though. When I was 7, it was 1860, Father started making preparations to go back to California. It may have had something to do with the Civil War. I'm not sure about that. But by 1861 in the spring, we were on the trail, this time in a covered wagon, traveling with 75 other wagons from 4 a.m. to 7 p.m., 7 days a week. Some wagon trains would stop on Sundays to observe the Sabbath, but my father knew that we needed to travel every available day. So we observed the Sabbath while walking on Sundays. On a good day, you could go 15 miles. An average day, about 10 miles, and on a very bad day, you could travel all day long and still see your campsite from the night before. We would stop in the evenings about 7 o'clock, and everyone would set to doing their chores, and my chore was to gather buffalo chips for fuel, because in the middle of this country there are not very many trees. So I would head out and I would gather buffalo chips, and then we'd have our meal and we'd settle in for some songs and stories and games. And one night when I was running around playing some sort of chasing game, my skirts got tangled around my legs and I fell into the campfire. And my whole outfit went up in flames and I was very badly burnt. My pinky finger was burnt right down to the first knuckle. And my hip was so badly injured that I never fully recovered full use of motion. I used a cane for the rest of my life. But my father was very proud of the fact that no one in our wagon train died on that trip. There were graves all along the trail. About every 80 feet or so you'd see a freshly dug grave. And we didn't lose anyone in our wagon train. In fact, we were one member stronger when we got to California because my mother gave birth to my baby sister in the mountains of California. Now, we didn't stay put in California very long. Father had a condition Mother used to refer to as wanderlust. And we traveled a lot to Nevada and Salt Lake City, and finally came up in 1868 into Montana. And I was hired in Phillipsburg to be the first school teacher there. I was about 16 years old. You really only had to be able to read and write, and it helped if you'd finished the 8th grade. Frank was a teacher in his early days too. Why didn't you stick with that?
Oh, I had this thing called wanderlust.
Oh, wanderlust. Seems like several men had the wanderlust. Well, I taught in Phillipsburg briefly. You know, a term of school was only about 3 months long. And then I came to Deer Lodge with my family, and then Father and I came over in 1870 to Missoula for the first time. And I was immediately hired to teach school in Missoula. Now, I have a whole long tale of being a frontier school teacher, but Mrs. Dickinson over there was actually the first school teacher in Missoula, so I'll let her tell you about being a teacher. My mother passed away while I was teaching school, and I had to go back to Deer Lodge, and I came back in the spring of 1871, and at that time I could have taken up teaching again had I not been courting. But it was considered unseemly conduct for a woman to court and teach, and it certainly wasn't acceptable for a woman to be married and
Remember
teach.
when we'd sneak around though?
You don't know who's listening. I met Mr. Woody through mutual friends, and we began courting. And courting in those days was very proper, never done outside the company of your father or your brother or uncle or some other male relative. And he would come over and sit and visit, and that's how we would court. Sometimes we'd go for a walk with Father walking behind. We were married in December of 1871 on Frank's 38th birthday. I was 18 years old at that time.
Which is just about right.
He was well established. I had to sell this whole thing to my father. Well established, able to provide for me. We were married for 45 years, and we had 9 children. And sadly, only 3 of our children grew to adulthood. We lost 6 children in a 10-year span of time. Scarlet fever, 1 to morphine poisoning, 1 to croup, and spinal meningitis. And they're all buried here, all except our daughter Flora. Flora was our little princess of the family, and she's buried at Arlington National Cemetery with her officer husband, Davis Catlin Anderson, who she wrote about extensively in her society column in the Missoulian at the time. Our son Frank was a lawyer with his father, and Frank would give us our only grandchildren, 3 grandchildren. And our daughter Allie, she was the longest lived of all of us. She lived to be 91 years old. I think it's because she never married. She took care of us, and then she took care of herself. Well, I died at 66, so let's just see. But Allie, when Allie died, it was in the 60s, and she was the last one of our family to die, and this whole plot was full. So she made arrangements with the Stewarts, who are next door to us, for a free plot. There's our son Frank, and then there's a Stewart grave, and then there's Allie. So she's as close to the family as she could possibly get. So Frank died in 1916 of hardening of the arteries, sclerosis of the liver.
I don't remember that.
And I died in 1919 of a condition called paralysis agitans, which is now called Parkinson's disease. But we had a good life together, 45 years. If anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to take those now, unless you have something. He always comes up with one last thing. There it is.
Let's see. I wasn't going to say anything, but there's somebody here today that you might want to go see, and that's Mary Gleim.
Oh,
She's a madam on Front Street, and we didn't get along, to say it kindly. And she ran the red light district and she was involved in a murder attempt and went to my court, and I sentenced her to 14 years hard labor. And but she had great lawyers working for her, that she may have put through law school or given other favors to. And anyway, they overturned my ruling at the state court level, which I wasn't proud of. I had a cousin here, a second cousin, Joe Dixon, that he was pretty influential in trying to shut down the red light district. And unfortunately, I let a lot of bad things about Mary's prior life be told in court. It had nothing to do with the attempt on Bobby Burns' life, that she dynamited his house or had it dynamited. Anyway, I don't want to get into that, but I just already did, I guess. But Mary Gleim will tell you probably a totally different story about what an angel she was. And so just remember, I was a judge. She was a madam, so who are you going to believe? But we really like to see you out here, and hopefully there will be more of these. Right now it's not looking too good. This might be the last one. And then what do? We just go back to sleep, or okay?
It's bought and paid for. We might as well use it.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
He was trained as a merchant and a bookkeeper in Troy, New York, when he was 14. He came west in 1852 by a clipper ship to San Francisco. It took me 4.5 months. He failed in the gold fields in California and Oregon. He passed through Walla Walla on my way to Caulfield Goldfields. He returned to Dalles after hearing of all the Indian killings. Part of the trip was on foot because the natives stole his horses. He joined the Oregon Volunteers to fight Indians. He marched back to Walla Walla to rescue the Hudson Bay trading post that was ransacked by the natives in 1855. He was in the Battle of Walla Walla near the Whitman Mission. It was a 3-day battle from December 7th to December 10th, when reinforcements arrived, and he saw very few natives the rest of the winter. He was at the 1855 and 1856 treaty signing with the Indians. October 1st, 1858, he was the first civilian postmaster of
Schoolmer.
No, right there.
Walla Walla.
Of Walla Walla. I ran a store in Walla Walla selling 30,000 of goods in 1859, and he still ended up 9,000 in debt. Not all the farmers and miners could pay their bills that year. He left Walla Walla with my partner Christopher Higgins and our clerk Frank Woody. We left Walla Walla with a pack train of 76 animals carrying merchandise and the first safe to enter Montana via the new Mullen Pass Road to Missoula.
There, thank you. Now, Hannah, you know a little bit about your grandmother.
Vacation?
Yeah. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Wordens. I'm not a Worden. I'm a Worden by marriage, and I think probably the most interesting person of all is Lucretia Worden. And she was a little girl of about 11 years old and came through. Her parents were coming through. They were on their way. They were from Pennsylvania, and they were on their way to the gold fields. Well, because of the Indian uprising, they decided they better come north and instead of going through Salt Lake. And so they got here, and Mrs. Worden was expecting a third child. And so they stopped at the Hellgate store, and I guess they didn't bring my pictures out, did they?
Do you want me to text my dad and tell him to bring them?
Yeah, but they stopped at the Hellgate store, and where that is now, is you know where the Hellgate store is on Mullen Road? Well, if you go out Mullen Road, there's a Hellgate store there. If you'd go to the last trailer house, their storage bin, and look east, it's out on that point is where the first Worden store was.
But it's not there anymore. It got taken down a while
It
ago.
got taken down, but I think there's a log or two up there. So, but they were interested. And this little girl was 11 years old, the Millers, and so they stopped. And she'd hang around this store that Mr. Worden had started. The store was about this big, you know, and 20 by 24. And finally, he decided he'd like, when she was 14, he asked her to marry him. And he was 37. And they were married and had 7 children. And my husband was a grandson of the first Mr. Henry Worden. So that's where we are. Now, I'm a Prison City kiddie, so I'm a Deer Lodge. My dad was the warden of the prison in Deer Lodge, and then I married a Worden. It's pronounced Worden. No relation to Worden's Market. They came in with Mr. Hammond, and that probably would have been, I don't know when they came in, late 80s, but Worden's Market is Donovan Worden, the attorney, and our market was on Main Street where the parking garage is. So anyway, that's kind of the sum of it all. But that little Lucretia, I'd love to talk about her because I think she must have been just wonderful. Do you want to add something, Hannah? Loud.
Well, once their kids' names were Lucina, Henry Owen Worden.
Lucina is buried right over there. She was a Sterling.
So these 2 families are...
Yeah, this is
very
all
close to
family.
each other?
All family. Okay, go on.
Henry Owen Worden, Carolina M. Worden, Louis M. Worden, Frank L. Worden, Horace B. Worden, and Ruth Miller Worden. And Francis Lyman Worden died in February 5th, 1887. How did he die again?
Contracted pneumonia.
Yeah.
Laying out the water system, and came down and left this little girl that he'd married at 14, left her with the 7 children. And all of them, with the exception of Bill's father, had beautiful educations. So I guess the Sterlings aren't here. One of the Sterling grandchildren's here, and I don't know what happened to. I'm from Deer Lodge, but they're supposed to be coming along. But Mr. Sterling came in with Hammond. And Hammond was the big gun. Big gun. Mr. Robinson and I speak at Leadership Missoula, and he's always getting up talking about Mr. Hammond this and Mr. Hammond that. So I said, would you like me to tell you about Mr. Hammond? And he said, well, it doesn't matter whether I want you to or not, because you're going to. A.B. Hammond was a handsome, handsome man. Came in with the McLeods and all. And he was crazy about this Lyde Catlin. And Lyde Catlin wouldn't give him the time of day. Well, God, he was just half frantic over this, you know, because he loved her so. Well, the Eddies of Eddy Avenue fame seized upon this opportunity to bring their niece Florence out. So Florence comes out, and they set it all up. Well, the day of the wedding, now Aunt Ruth, who's right over here, Aunt Ruth tells me that what happened, she was 11 years old, she's at the church. No A.B. Hammond. The church is full. Finally, some man got up and went to the house, and here's Mr. Hammond lying on his bed, perfectly happy, hands behind his head, looking at the ceiling. The man said, Frank, it's your wedding day. And Hammond said, yep. And he says, get up, you SOB, or I'll shoot you. And he took him to the church. Now, I don't know if that's so or not, but that's what I heard. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Frankie? You gave that.
Shotgun
How about, huh?
Kind of a shotgun wedding?
A little shock. Well, I guess that's what we'd call it, isn't it? Well, they were a wonderful family, and Mr. Worden was really quite exceptional. He was a great statesman. But my son Hank we have some transcripts, and Hank says it's the best Western story you've ever read. The fighting and the infighting about the properties and that. Oh, he said it's fascinating. He said what's in there. There you are. You talk about that, Hank. The article, but you found about all the fighting between them.
Oh yeah, Frankie has the stats on that. That's what he has.
Yeah.
Hear that, Frankie?
The battle. Well, I want you to talk about.
The Battle of Walla Walla?
No, Hank, I want you to talk about when you looked through that book that I gave you about all the fighting and about Patty Canyon and remember?
All after he died.
The big fight. They had a big fight, all of them, and you know, and of course they're all related, so you have to be very careful.
Yeah.
Now, Worden's Market is no relation to this Worden. They came in with the McLeods and Hammonds. We are the original Wordens. How do you like that? Do you have anything to add?
Store clerks as well?
No.
Pardon?
Store clerks as well?
I didn't hear you.
Were they store clerks or they had...
Well, yeah, Bill's father was a store clerk. And what Francis did, he wasn't any good at gold mining. So what he did was he set up supplies and stores all along the way. And he met Mr. Higgins. I used to talk to a lot of grade school kids, and I said, can you imagine they're fighting the Indian Wars, and they're sitting around a campfire. And Higgins had been a commissary man for the Stevens expedition, which came out and laid out the railroad. And he said, Christopher Higgins says, you know, Frank, I know where there's a great place for a trading post. And he said, where? He said, well, when I was coming through with that exposition, he said, there's a valley that 5 other valleys open into it. And he said it would be ideal for a trading post. So they packed up their gear after the war, went back to Walla Walla. Now, you know how hard it is to get to Walla Walla today? Can you imagine coming from Walla Walla with 76 horses? Is that what you said, a pack train of 76? Can you imagine that? And so off they came and started Missoula. And it was started out at that point out there. I told you, go to the end of those storage units and look directly, and you'll see this point. There's a trailer house out there now. They wouldn't let you do it now, but in that day and age, you could get by with it. So, do you have any questions at all?
Missoula was originally going to be named Wardensville, but Francis decided not to call it that.
And he was in the first legislature, wasn't he?
Yeah.
He was apparently a quiet man. That kind of runs in the family, and they get mouthy wives. Apparently, that's what happens. Apparently, that's what happens. Yeah, mouthy wives. So anyway, and the Dixons, they're supposed to be here, and the Sterlings, you know, they're all tied in together and all married. I know several little stories, but I don't think I'll tell them since the other people are here. When they're not here, I tell stories on them too, but we'll skip that today. So, any other questions? Well, this has been a great program, hasn't it? It's a lot of fun.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about Josephine Dukes today. And Josephine Dukes was the first white woman to come to this part of Montana and live here continuously until she died. I do have to refer to my notes because, you know, at this age I forget a lot. I just don't remember these dates very well. So I'll start I was born in 1838 in Florissant, Missouri, and my brother, Robert A. Pelkey, had been out here working on the Mullen Road in the late 1850s or early 1860s, and he purchased some land out at Grass Valley. And he came back to Florissant, which is close to St. Louis, and he told the family, he says, you know, he said, it's so beautiful out there in Montana, we really should all just move out there. So I was married. I had been married to my husband Peter Meininger, and we had a little boy who was about 2 years old, and so we decided, okay, we'll go out to Montana. And my sister-in-law, Robert's wife, and I and my mother, Renee Queen Pelkey, we're just going to go out to Montana. And so we started out and everything was going fine until we got to, my little boy's name was Tommy, and we got to Fort Hall, and boy, you know, Peter he just didn't have any experience helping wagons and horses and wagons cross the river on the Snake River there. And going across the Snake River, why, it got kind of hectic, and my sister-in-law and I and my little boy were in one wagon, and Peter was trying to take the horses across the river, and darned, the horse came up and hit Peter and knocked him under. And you know, we waited around, tried to find Peter, and we couldn't find him, and we waited around. Hi, how are you doing? Come on up. I'm just beginning this story, so I'll just continue. And my husband, and we were crossing the Snake River down in Idaho, and my husband, he drowned in the Snake River as we were coming out here. And so my little boy and I and my sister-in-law were in the wagon bed, and the river lifted that wagon bed up off the wheels, and we started floating down the river. And here comes, you know, we thought we were in for trouble, and we finally hit a sandbar, and an Indian, bless his heart, came out and saved us and got us back to shore. But we lost a lot of our supplies that way, and that day, and so we thought, well, you know, we've waited 2 days, looked for Peter, and that was my husband, and he obviously drowned, and we decided, well, we had to go on. So we came on, and my brother, Robert, had purchased some land out here at Grass Valley. And I thought, what am I going to do? Here I am, a widow, and I have a 2-year-old little boy. What am I going to do to support us? And, well, I had packed in one of the trunks that survived, I had a couple of dresses that I had brought from St. Louis. And why I brought dresses from St. Louis out here, pretty dresses, I don't know. But anyway, it came in useful because I took the skirt off one of the dresses and I made a flag. And I hung the flag up and I thought, I know how to bake. There are very few women, 3 women out here, and look at all these men out here, and I know how to bake. And so I baked pies, and I sold pieces of pie for a $5 gold piece per slice. Yeah, you laugh at that. Sounds outrageous, doesn't it? But in 1861, flour, very poor flour, was going for $30 a hundred, and those guys didn't know how to bake pies, but I did. And so I sold the pies and made some money. And you have to excuse me because once I'm going to have to refer to my notes here because at my age, you know, how can we remember what our kids did, and we did that long ago. And so then in the spring, I came out here and landed. There's this beautiful spot out by Hell's Gate where Warden Higgins had the store, and the two rivers come together. And I could see the Indians coming through, migrating from up north down to the Bitterroot and back, and it was just such a beautiful sight. It was a beautiful place. And by spring, I had met this fellow by the name of George P. White, and we got married. We were the first white man and white woman to be married in the territory. And our records are up at the university. They have this university here now, and our marriage record is up there. And Brooks married us, and they called him Bishop Brooks after that. But I have to tell you about our wedding. It was in the spring. It was in March, and it had been a horribly cold winter. And, you know, it was so exciting. We were going to have something to look forward to. And, well, Captain Grant, he'd gone on over to Walla Walla for something, and he had, up at his ranch, the fellow who was taking care of his ranch, he says, now I've got these chickens here. And he says, don't you let anything happen to those chickens. Don't you sell them. Don't you do anything. I'll be back. I want those chickens here when I come back. Well, this fellow, you know, Frank Woody, and a fellow by the name of Sterney Blake, they thought, what are we going to do? Well, there's chickens up there. So they went up there, and we had chicken dinner that night for our wedding. And somebody asked, well, how'd you get the chicken? And they said, well, Woody talks so much, the poor man just was glad to be rid of us, let us go, you know. So we had chicken for chicken dinner for our wedding, and then Sterney Blake stole the wedding cake, and so the big thing, you know, it was a really good, exciting time. Well, so we had this cabin. The cabin still exists out at Hell's Gate, and here's a picture of me later on, but here's our cabin, and it's still a residence. There are people living it, and that's me with a couple of my daughters, but here's where the cabin was. And we had, you know, the history books, or legend, says that George P. White had 3 sons born in 3 different states. And that's what the history legend is. Well, that's even in Ripley's Believe It or Not back here. I've got that back here somewhere. Right there. You can come up here and look. It says 3-state log cabin, Missoula, Montana, and lists my children, or George's children. He had those, well, you know what, George didn't have those kids, I did. I was there too, but it didn't matter at that time, you know. But anyway, so, and I have to preface this by saying that I worked at the Missoula County Courthouse for 33 years, and I was in charge of the Records Management Department. So I had to find out if those 3 children were all born in that same cabin in 3 different states. Well, none of them were born in a state. any state because we were, two of them were born, they were all born in the cabin, but one was born in Idaho Territory, one was born in Montana Territory. None of them were born in Montana because I would have been past childbearing age if I was still having children then. We became a state in 1889, so no. But anyway, we had 5 children in that cabin, and Richard's over here, and George is down there, and Agnes, the wife of my son William, is over there. Then this one is my granddaughter, Georgie, and this is my stone over here. But anyways, I have to turn the page, find out my dates, I'm sorry. I have to tell you about Hell's Gate. The second building up at Hell's Gate, of course, when I got there, Warden and Higgin had their store there already on the Mullen Road. And when I got there, and then in 1861, a fellow by the name of P.J. Bolte built a saloon up there, right in Hell's Gate. And here's Hell's Gate right here. There's the town, and here's where my cabin was. And anyway, Bolte built a saloon up there, and in November, was it married? It's November. I don't remember what month it was that he built that. But anyways, he had this saloon up there, and it was January. And it was cold, and at night I heard hammering, and I heard sawing, and I thought, what is going on? And I looked up there, because you can see it's just a little ways up there. And here's all these lanterns, these men, they're constructing something, but I thought, I'm not going to go out and look and see what it is. Well, the next morning I went out there, and here's 3 guys hanging up there. That was Cyrus Skinner, Carter, and I forget the other man's name. I'll have to look for that. But anyway, 3 guys, and that was the first. And then the next morning, when I went, as I said, when I went out the next morning, the vigilantes went up to Baron O'Keefe's place and brought Bob Zachary down, and they hanged him up there too. And that was the last hanging by trial and the vigilantes here in the state of in the territory of Montana. Got to switch the page over here, see where I am. And like I said, our 3 sons were born up there. None of them were born in a state, so we know that. But we had 2 little girls up there also. And one of them was Mary Rosetta. She ended up dying a little bit later, but our other daughter's name was Lily, and we called her Lily White. And I just had to tell that story because Lily White was such a precious little girl. Father Ravalli was a neighbor of ours up there. Of course, St. Michael's Church up at Hell's Gate was the first church built in the territory of Montana specifically for Anglo whites, not the white family, but for Anglos, you know. And so there was a cemetery up there also, and Father Ravalli would visit there, and I would travel with him as a midwife, and we became very dear friends. One of my best friends was an Indian woman by the name of Katuna, and in 1877, when the Indians came through, the Nez Perce came through, and they were coming through very peacefully, but the army was following them, and it kind of threw everybody here in a panic, and well, we better go to the hills and hide. Well, of course, and I said, Katuna took me up there, but then it was in the newspapers even that we could come home, it was safe, and of course there was no confrontation up Lolo Creek like they had predicted, and that didn't affect us anymore after that. But George and I had a butcher shop down on Front Street here also. We still lived out at Hell's Gate, but we had a butcher shop on Front Street. And we sold that to Alfred Mailer in '70. And I have to tell you this because we sold it to him for $1,000, good clean dust. And the terms were that He would pay us $400 in June and $200 good clean dust in August, and finish up the last $400 good clean dust in September. And that's how transactions were made, was good clean dust, you know. That's it. The smokehouse burned up there, but it didn't burn our house, but we lost 2,000 pounds of meat, which hurt us pretty bad. Then George got sick, and this was in 1871. He got sick, and it was just pretty tragic because the doctors did everything they could for him, but they couldn't save him, and so he died, and I was widowed for the second time, and now I had 6 children, 5 by George and 1 by my first husband, Peter. Well, it got, you know, it was kind of hard, but that's how life was here. That's how life was. And in 1872, Ed Dukes and I got married. And we got married in December. And we didn't have a big party or anything at that time, but it was noted, ironically it was noted, that he was not Catholic. Now Josephine was very religious, the church was very important to them. As I said, the church was just a very short ways away from the property, and the cemetery was there. And George, in his obituary, says that he was buried at the Catholic cemetery. Now, I've been over to the Catholic cemetery here, and they have a record that he's buried there, but they don't know where, or they don't know. So, question in my mind is, was he buried at the Catholic cemetery by the church out at Hell's Gate, which is now the church, that church is now at Fort Missoula. But I would like to know, because that cemetery existed for quite some years after the church was moved. Anyway, we had some land out at Frenchtown, or we owned part interest in the Pioneer Flouring Mill out at Frenchtown, and that area out there was just so good, that was so fertile for growing grain, that some of the grain out there won prizes at the World Fair, and that we ended up having to sell that, but we did have a part interest in that. And then George, in October, we had 3 children, not George, Edwin. Edwin and I had 3 children, so then I was the mother of 9. And in '82, same time of year as this, it's time to get the crops in, and Ed came down with smallpox. And the doctor was treating him. He treated him for 10 days, and finally he says, you're getting better. So Ed's out there, and the neighbors are all helping get the crops in, and so Ed went out and started helping, and he told me, and he says, I don't think I feel very good. I'm just going to go lay down over there and rest by the hay stack for a little while. Well, he died. So here I am, widowed 3 times with 9 children, and that's just, I learned to take things just that way. That's just how things were. Well, then in 1893, City of Missoula is putting the water mains in downtown, and I did have some property down there, but anyway, they had this trench dug, and it was about 4 feet deep. It was a dark night, and they hadn't put flashers up, they hadn't put any barricade up or anything. There were no lights, and I fell in the ditch, and I got hurt pretty bad. I hurt my head and my shoulder and my leg and hip, and I went to the doctor, and for quite a while the doctor was treating me, and finally he says, you know what, Josephine, you're just going to be crippled the rest of your life. And I couldn't do that. I had always worked hard, and it was very difficult to be crippled. And so talking with the doctor, while he's consulting with him, we decided I should sue the City of Missoula. So I did. I sued the City of Missoula for $10,000. And I won. I got $150. Well, you know what? 2 weeks later, some man walking down the same thing happened to him, exactly the same circumstances. He sued the city of Missoula for $5,000 and he won. He got $500. So that's just how it was, you know. And I died in 1903 from apoplexy. But I have to tell you some of the things that happened when I was living out at Hell's Gate. Hell's Gate existed from 1860 to 1865, and the population was never more than 14 people, and the average population was 12. And there were only 7 buildings at Hell's Gate at that time. And I think I told you about the hangings out there. Well, that was the last hanging by vigilantes, a legal hanging by execution by hangings. And I don't know if I told you that the first church for white people was built out there. Okay. And then, but these hangings, you know, nobody, and then they had, in the 2 years between 64 and 65, they had 9 or 10 violent deaths. There were no natural deaths at that time. And I'm thinking that maybe that's why my husband George was made the coroner, but I don't know if that's why he was a coroner or not. But anyway, that's the story of Josephine Dukes. And I have to also tell you this, that, as I said, I worked at the county with the records. And in doing that, we microfilmed a lot of the records and a lot of the probate records. And now, you two are man and wife, I assume? Well, when you die, you'll have separate probate numbers, as well the rest of us have separate probate numbers. Well, in microfilming these early probate records, and this is in 1883, one of my staff came up and she said, "Look at this." She says, "We have the estate of George P. White." My second husband has 2 numbers. He's number 44 and number 48. And look at this. Here's the estate of Edwin Dukes, my third husband. He has the numbers for probate numbers 44 and 48. And we're thinking, what is this? Why do these 2 men share probate numbers? And we thought, was there a gay community? We didn't know, you know. And if so, what's up? So each of these items down here is an entry in the probate. So we started reading down through, and this woman named Josephine, she's petitioning the court to get guardianship of these children. And we're wondering why. Come to find out, she's their mother. And in 1888, because she had been married to both of these men and had children by both of them, she had to petition the courts to get custody of her, or guardianship of her own children. And I thought, this is a good story, you know. This is a good story. How many women came out here, had the same kind of hardships that they faced, widows, losing husbands, children, and how do you raise these children, and then to have to petition the court to get guardianship of your own children. I thought, this is a story that needs to be told, and that's why I'm telling this story. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Thank you.
My name is Christopher P. Higgins. You can call me Hap. Cap, my friends do. I do not allow Mr. Bonner that privilege, but please call me Cap. I was born in 1830, just outside Dublin, Ireland. I, along with thousands of other Irishmen, left that lovely Green Isle in 1848 to escape that dreadful potato famine. You've probably read all about that. So I immigrated to the United States, and by 57, I found myself in the 53, excuse me, I'm a little confused. See, the press does that to you. They just confuse you. Anyway, in 53, I found myself in St. Paul. Now, it was that year that Isaac Stevens had just been appointed governor of the newly created Washington Territory. While in St. Paul, he hired me to be his wagon master for that expedition. Now, our charge in going west was not only to get the governor to his place of administration, but also to scout for a possible location for a northern transcontinental railroad route. And we were also to take a look at the flora and fauna, much as Lewis and Clark had done earlier, and make peace with the Indian tribes. Now, this is not an easy thing to do if you're familiar at all with the history of the Indians in western Montana. We met in '53 here in the valley with the chiefs of the Salish, Kootenai, and Penderai tribes, and the governor promised him that he would maintain peace with the Blackfeet. Not an easy thing to do, given the centuries of depredation by the Blackfeet upon the rest of the Indians, particularly in Hellgate Canyon. So you can understand if the Indians were a little bit doubtful this could happen. But in the intervening 2 years, there had been minor thefts. But as Chief Victors told the governor, that it is the esteem in which the governor was held that maintained peace in western Montana for the first time in centuries. So we returned in '55 in order to formalize a treaty at Council Grove. Now, I remember it vividly. We were coming back, it was the summer, it was July 4th, '55. And we're crossing the Bitterroot River, and it was almost in flood state. It had been a late spring, lots of runoff, lots of rain. So we were crossing the river on 3 rafts. The first 2 smaller wooden rafts were easily poled ashore across the river. The third raft, the larger one, carrying myself, the governor, and most of our supplies, we lost control of it, got caught in the current and was racing down the rapids to sure destruction. So I just simply grabbed hold of the tow rope, jumped into the river, swam ashore, ran alongside till it came to a nice big tree where I could wrap the rope around so the governor's boat would just slowly, gently come to shore, saving the governor's life, saving the expedition. Thank you, thank you, thank you. A few days later, we did meet with the Indians. They agreed in the Hellgate Treaty that the 3 tribes will settle as one. It's the Flathead in a reservation, either to be in the Bitterroot or in the Mission Mountains, to be determined later. It would take almost 40 years before the Indians, all of them, would finally leave the Bitterroot. Now, we returned to Walla Walla, we returned to Washington, and there I was captain in the quartermaster's department, but I soon realized that my future did not lie with the Army. There's something about this valley that kept coming back to me. And I had a dream, a commercial dream, a commercial hub, because what you have here, to the north, you've got the Jocko Indian Agency. To the south, you've got the Bitterroot with their settlers, with the Indians. And now, running east-west, you have got the new Mullen Trail. So everything and anybody coming through western Montana is going to have to come through here. So after years of thinking about it and getting investors or whatever, in 1860, I resigned my commission. In Walla Walla, I bought out the Isaacs interest in the Isaacs and Warden store, convinced my new partner, Francis Warden, he's up there on the knoll, convinced him that we should sell out everything we had in Walla Walla and move it all to Montana. We got a federal permit to trade with the Indians. We loaded 76 pack animals with all our merchandise, all our supplies, and Frank Woody, our clerk, who would go on to become mayor and judge, and he's buried past Francis over there. And we came out here. We settled 4 miles west of here. Out on the Mullen Trail, there's something called a Walmart. There's a Walmart out there. See, my dream continues. My dream continues. I was right. So about 4 miles west of here. We started in a tent. But shortly after that, we had David Patty provide us with some wood, some timbers for a structure. We hired the Frenchman, Narcisse Sandpar, to build us a 16 by 18 log building, sod roof that became our store. We built a root house, 1.5 story house, cabin, bunkhouse. Within months, the village of Hellgate was thriving. It was the perfect location, as I said. It was a wonderful spot, except it was one of the most violent cities or towns in the West. It certainly lived up to its name, Hellgate Village. For example, in our short existence in Hellgate, we never had more than 14 permanent inhabitants. We had 9 violent deaths. So do the math. Do the math. Not a healthy environment. Now, the worst year was 64. Now, 64 was a big year for us, but it was also our most violent. You familiar with Sheriff Plummer and his road agents down in Bannock in Virginia City? Well, some of his gang came here. One of his chief lieutenants was a man by the name of Cyrus Skinner. He arrived in Hellgate. He bought the old P.J. Bolt Saloon and reopened it. He and his friend, another one of Plummer's gang, Alec Carter, proceeded to terrorize our tiny community. Skinner would frequently come into our store, hop on our safe, and regale us with his tales of debauchery, murder, and mayhem. This made us not just a little nervous, because at times our safe held $65,000 worth of gold dust. So this was not a healthy situation. I offered Cyrus $50 in hard, cold cash to get out of town. He laughingly refused. He shouldn't have. The vigilantes knew where he was, and they came to town. They rode into town, they rode right on out town, realized they missed, came back, stopped in front of Skinner's Saloon, where Cyrus was just standing wondering what these idiots were doing. They nabbed him, they nabbed Carter, brought him to my store for a quick trial, then hung him in my corral. We went back to the saloon, and there in the back room, Johnny Cooper was bleeding from a pistol wound earlier in the day, also one of the Plummer's gang. So we took him out to the corral, hung him off the same pole using the same soapbox. Some other vigilantes then went out to Baron O'Keefe's. There they came upon Bob Zachary. Now, they're ready to hang him on the spot, but Baron O'Keefe would not allow that to happen. Afraid of ghosts. Didn't want the bad feelings out there. So after the Baron also gave Zachary a full, hearty breakfast, Zachary was brought to town and hung. More vigilantes went up to Frenchtown. There they found George Shears and hung him at the blacksmith's. Final problem was resolved as they went down to Stevensville, where they gathered Whiskey Bill Graves, captured him, and hung him on the spot. Justice was very swift in those days. But it reminds me, story, this happens a couple years later when we're in Missoula. It was after the war, 66, it must have been about 67. A man by the name of Joseph Dufranc had been arrested, tried, and convicted of killing Louis Grandmaison in Stevensville. We had the only jail, so they brought him here. Now, our jail was not real secure because very soon DeFrank found that he could let himself in and out very easily. But it's winter. Why bother? He's warm. He's getting room and board. Well, wait. So he's enjoying winter in our jail, coming and going as he wants. But then one night, the roof catches fire because of an overheated stovepipe. Well, he can't put it out himself, so lets himself out of the jail, goes on over across the street, knocks on the door of the sheriff and says, "Come on, help me put the fire out." Sheriff, who did not know this was what's going on, goes, they put the fire out. Sheriff realizes jail needs a little bit more security. So we get a bigger door, a bigger, stronger lock. DeFrank waits until spring when he digs his way out, and we never hear from him again. So interesting things do happen in these early days. Now, I mentioned '64 as being a pivotal year. Not only was it the violence, but it was in that year, fall of that year, that Francis Worden and I built a sawmill 4 miles upriver from Hellgate. It's about where your Holiday Inn is located now. The next year, we built a grist mill, we moved our store, we built a house, we built we built the Masonic Hall, and within years, just a couple of years, Hellgate Village disappeared completely. Missoula Mills rose up instead. Now, the early history of Missoula Mills revolves around the competition between myself and that man back there, Mr. Bonner. He continues to haunt me. He continues to look over my shoulder. Plagues me no end. But Mr. Bonner and his associates arrived in town in '66. They brought 128 mules loaded with merchandise, and they opened what eventually would become the Missoula Mercantile. My store was Missoula Mills, Worden and Company. Well, Mr. Bonner, in 1870, hires a man by the name of Andrew Hammond. Excuse me a minute here. Mr. Hammond was hired first as a clerk, rose to become managing partner, the force behind the Mercantile. It is my sincere belief that Hammond's one goal in life was my destruction. And he proceeded very methodically to do this. Got peaked somewhat in the late 70s, early 80s as we struggled to get the Northern Pacific Railroad to stop in Missoula and to have a rail yard here. You understand how important it is to have a railroad in your town. The railroad bypasses your town, you might as well pack up shop and leave. Well, I, along with Francis, Washington J. McCormick, and A.J. Erlin, owned most of the property in downtown Missoula. So we gave the Northern Pacific lots of prime property in town to encourage them to stop and settle. This worked. They did. And this ensures Missoula's success. We, as investors, hoped that we would benefit by some sort of contracts to help provide for the Northern Pacific. But Hammond and Bonner had provided nothing to the NP, nothing. But behind the scenes, with their political maneuvering, with their bribery, with their working with men, again, behind the scenes, men like Marcus Daly, with principal investors of the Northern Pacific itself, they got all the contracts to provide all the timber for the Northern Pacific going through Montana. They then built a mill out in Bonner, naming it Bonner, to provide timbers. And they happened to just, by the way, know where the Northern Pacific was going so they could lay those timbers all along the trail. They cut land, they cut timber off everybody's land, public, private, the National Forest, the reservation. This blatantly illegal timbering and the whole business management idea came to the attention of President Cleveland's administration. His Attorney General took notice, started to enforce the timber laws more strongly. A federal jury indicted Bonner and Hammond. And then, the Republicans won the election. President Harrison came into office. Nothing happened. Everything was dropped. Bonner and Hammond were off the hook to continue raping the timber environment. Hammond didn't stay in town too long. He went to the Pacific Northwest, got more rich by investing in railroads, timber, and shipping. But before he left, he continued to squeeze. The next attempt on me was my bank. I had built the very first bank in Missoula, the Missoula National Bank in '73, thanks to investors like the territorial governor, Sam Hauser. And without getting into a lot of very boring economic details, Hammond managed to get on the board, began to squeeze, began to question everything we did, every loan we made, every transaction, until finally Sam Hauser and some of the other major investors had no other choice. It was either Cap or the bank. And though Hauser's on record as he wants to be good to Cap, Hauser is an investor first, and I am out. I lose my bank. But I'm not done. I immediately start to build a new bank. I call it the Higgins Bank. Nothing wrong with my ego. Unfortunately, October 14th, 1889, days before I'm ready to open the bank, as I'm leaving for lunch, I collapse and die in the middle of the street. Stomach catarrh, if you'd like to know. I had been a very healthy, very fit man. Nobody knew I'd been sick for a very long time until I just simply passed out and died. My funeral procession was 2 miles long and had 148 carriages. That shows the esteem in which I had been held by the citizens of Missoula. When Hammond died, hardly a mention in the paper, hardly notice was made. There is no Hammond Street. There's no Hammond statue. Now Bonner, Mr. Bonner dies in the very first automobile accident in town in 1902. Apparently had a heart attack while at the wheel and dies on Higgins Avenue. I'd like to think I was right beside him at the time. Now, those of you from the university area probably know more about my family than perhaps you think you do, because a number of the streets are named after my children. Now, when I first plotted the streets for the area, starting right under Mount Sentinel was going to be Francis Street, named after my oldest son, my oldest child, Frank. Now, Frank would go on to raise a volunteer cavalry regiment in the Spanish-American War. Unfortunately, they would never get out of Camp Thomas in Georgia from training. And unfortunately, he contracted typhus. He would return. He would become mayor of Missoula, lieutenant governor of Montana, but would die too young in 1905. Now, from Francis, then there would have been George and John Street. Well, the university took over those. They don't exist. But then there's Morris. Now, you may see it spelled Maurice, but please, it's Morris. Then there's Arthur, Helen, Hilda, Ronald, and Gerald. They're my children. Most of them are here with me now. Now, Morris had a very tragic end. Morris was murdered in 1892, 3 years after my death. Now, it was August 14th, 1892. Fire had broken out in Missoula. Now, if you know, fire is the worst thing that can happen in a frontier town. It can just devastate everything. So my son Morris and some friends were going out to help fight the fire. Now, at the same time, in town were three criminals by the name of Goldenboggin, Burns, and Lyons. They had been associates in a number of robberies and heists in Spokane. Goldenboggin had split away, got away with most of the money, made it to Missoula. Burns and Lyons tracked him here. Somehow or other, Goldenboggin had Lyons arrested for stealing his watch. That was probably a stolen watch to begin with, but still. Lyons is arrested. Burns takes a particular exception to this and challenges Goldenboggin to a shootout behind the Blue Front Saloon on Front Street. Goldenboggin accepts this challenge, and in your typical Old West fashion, they meet behind the saloon with their pistols ready to go. They draw. Goldenboggin's shot goes wide. Burns shoots Goldenboggin right in the side. At this moment, Goldenboggin decides, well, maybe it'd be better just to get out of town. So he starts running. He turns and runs up towards Front Street. Burns wants to finish it. Burns wants this over. So he follows. And as he turns the corner, he fires up towards Front Street. At that second, Goldenboggin turns right in front of the saloon. My son, walking by, looks to see what the commotion is, gets a bullet right between the eyes. He does not die immediately. He is taken to the family home next to the bank on East Main. And there the doctors try to remove the bullet from the back of his head. Fortunately, my son never regains consciousness. He dies that evening. The citizens of Missoula, still holding the name Higgins in such esteem, they storm the jail and they're going to lynch Mr. Burns. With great difficulty, Sheriff Houston manages to prevent this from happening, and instead, we hang Burns legally 3 months later. Again, justice still very quick in the West. And now while I have so many people here, I would like to set the record straight on one thing that has been bothering me for years. You people complain about your traffic quite a bit. You people also seem to blame me for your traffic, and I want to set that record straight. It's in the late 1880s, and there are two lawyers. Always look for the lawyers. By the name of Stevens and Bickford. Familiar names, probably. They wanted to build a new town called South Missoula on the other side of the river. At that point in time, the Higgins Bridge was built at an angle connecting to the road that goes out to the fort. Now, Bickford and Stevens bought a lot of that property, and they began to lay their property lines perpendicular to that road. Well, I'm sorry, that is just plain stupid. It's counterproductive. It is not done that way. If you're laying property lines, you lay them according to section lines. That's north-south, east-west, not at some crazy angle. Well, personal friend of mine, Judge Knowles, owned the immediate property south of the river between the river and South Missoula development area. I owned most of what became the university area. We opposed this development, and when Bickford and Stevens went to the county commissioners to have the new town of South Missoula incorporated, the county commissioners just sadly shook their heads and said, you know, you're about a day late because Higgins and Judge Knowles just had the city annex the entire area. Then the bridge washed out in a flood, and it went in front of you, the voters of Missoula. Which way should that bridge be built? Should it be built the old way, connecting with Stevens Avenue and favoring the South Missoula development, or should it be built the right way, north-south? Well, you people voted the right way. You voted the Higgins way. I thank you, but please blame yourself for your traffic problems. Thank you.
So this is the music of the Civil War. Music played a very important role during the Civil War. Since they didn't have walkie-talkies or cell phones, they would use fifers and drummers who would play different tunes to signal to the troops different things, like when it was time to fire, when it was time to retreat, when it was time to get up in the morning and get ready for battle. And these fifers and drummers were between the ages of 10 and 16, so they were young and were responsible for a lot. This is actually, this book is called the Bruce and Emmett Drummers and Fifers Guide, and is the book that was written as the guide for fifers and drummers. So in this book has all of the different tunes that would be played for different signals and different battle calls, and also for entertaining the troops. The fifers and drummers would also entertain the troops, and they were responsible for keeping up the morale of the soldiers. Like if they were marching and had been hours of marching and it was a long day's journey, the fifer and drummer would play tunes to kind of take the soldiers' minds off of a long, hard day. And also, along with that, not only did they play those tunes while marching for entertainment, it was also used to calculate the distance they could travel. Like if you were marching at the tempo of 60 beats per minute, you could take about 60 steps in a minute, and they would measure that step size, and they could calculate how far that you can go in what amount of time. So the fifer and drummer would keep the soldiers marching in time to make sure that they got to their destination on time. And also towards the end of the Civil War, the bugle was actually becoming more popular because you could, it only took one hand to play, and you could play it and ride a horse at the same time, because it's a little bit difficult to ride a horse and be playing this at the same time. So here's a tune that'll play for you. This one is actually called Three Camps, or Reveille, and this one was used to get the soldiers awake and ready for the day. So here's Three Camps. And also, as another note, this is not a historically accurate fife. This one that I have here is actually more historically accurate, though not exactly. If it were historically accurate, all of these holes would be the exact same size because they would only use one drill to drill all of the holes. What makes this one not historically accurate is because it has 10 holes instead of 6, and it's in 2 pieces as well. And the reason for this is that I can play the notes more in tune and they're more accurate. So, yeah, it's the Fifers and Drummers of the Civil War. Thank you.
Thank you.